Left behind by the Horde, the beautiful Orc princess waited years for someone who never returned. The night the Horde left, Jaren didn't cry. She stood on the obsidian shelf above the valley, the wind carrying the last of the war drums south, and she watched the torchlight of 10,000 warriors shrink to a smear on the horizon. Her tusks caught the moonlight. Her hands, wrapped in iron war rings, were still. The other Orcish women had gone back inside the fortress walls before the last drumbeat faded. They understood departure. They had been raised on it. The Horde moved, conquered, moved again. That was the nature of things, as fixed and undeniable as the rotation of the moons. Jaren stayed on the shelf until the light disappeared entirely. Then she turned back to the fortress and started counting the days. His name had been Sergeant Marcus Vale, and he had come to them not as a prisoner and not as an ally, but as something the Orcish language had no clean word for. A human who walked into the Horde's outer camp without a weapon, without a flag of parley, without anything except a pack on his back, and a look on his face that suggested he had already considered the possibility of being gutted, and had decided it was an acceptable risk. The outer sentinels had brought him to the warlord's tent at Spearpoint. He'd walked the whole way like he was going for a morning stroll, which had impressed the sentinels more than they wanted to admit. Jaren had seen him first from the far side of the fire ring. She'd been reviewing supply manifests, one of the 36 tasks that fell to the warlord's daughter when her father was occupied with strategy, and she'd looked up because the sentinels were unusually quiet. That was how she first saw him, a lean human male, brown-skinned, with close-cropped hair going silver at the temples and a jaw that looked like it had been hit more than once and had simply decided not to care. He was carrying what turned out to be medical supplies. Stitching thread, wound paste, antiseptic compounds the Horde had run out of 3 weeks prior. He'd heard about the supply shortage from a goblin trader 2 days' walk east and had decided, apparently on his own authority, to do something about it. "Your sentinels let me carry a pack in," he said to her, because she was the one looking at him. "You might want to update your search procedure." She'd had him detained for 48 hours. Standard protocol. During those 48 hours, he'd repaired the hinges on the detainment cell door, taught 3 of the younger sentinels a card game from the human southern provinces, and apparently slept 9 hours without interruption, which the night watch reported with an expression of baffled outrage. On the 3rd morning, she'd let him out herself. "What do you want?" she'd asked him. "Work," he'd said. "I'm a field medic. I've been one for 11 years. The war made me, and the war ended, and now I'm just a man with a set of skills and nowhere particular to be." "The war ended for humans," she said. "The Horde has not stopped." "I know." He'd looked at her steadily, not the way human men usually looked at her, with fear, or that particular breed of bafflement that crossed their faces when they encountered an Orc woman with amber eyes and a mind like a razor. He'd looked at her the way you look at something you're genuinely curious about. "That's why I'm here. I figured if I was going to work, I might as well work somewhere that still needs working done." That was 7 years ago. In those 7 years, Marcus Vale had become something the Horde had no word for and then, slowly, had invented a word for. Veilcrath, which translated roughly as bone mender who does not run. He'd served 4 campaigns, stitched together warriors who should have died on the field, argued with Orcish healers about methodology with a patience that outlasted every attempt to drive him off, and somewhere in the 3rd year, quietly, without ceremony or announcement, had begun to be considered simply one of them. Not an Orc, not a human ally, Veilcrath. Jaren had fallen in love with him somewhere around year 2, in a medical tent during a rainstorm, when he'd been arguing passionately with her about the correct way to treat a nerve wound and had been absolutely wrong, and had known he was wrong within 30 seconds of her counterargument and had said, "All right, show me," without any ego in it at all, just a genuine desire to learn. She'd never met anyone, Orc, human or otherwise, who surrendered a wrong position that cleanly. She hadn't told him for another year. When she did tell him, he'd gone very still for a moment in that way he had, the way that meant he was processing something he hadn't anticipated. Then he'd said, quietly, "I was hoping you'd get around to that eventually." And that had been that. The Horde had not taken issue with it. Jarine was the warlord's daughter, and the warlord, old Grashmer, 7 feet and 200 years of war wisdom, had looked at Marcus Vale for a long time and then said, "He treats the wounded without preference. He doesn't flinch. He'll do." For Grashmer, that was a declaration of complete approval. They had 4 years then. 4 years of campaigns and council fires and the small, ordinary intimacies that accumulated between people who lived close together through danger. He had a way of finding her after a battle, even in the chaos, even when the field was still churning with noise and smoke. He always knew where she was. She asked him once how he managed it. He'd shrugged and said, "You move like you're looking for a problem to solve. I've learned your pace." She'd laughed at that, really laughed, the kind that surprised you, and he'd looked pleased with himself for the rest of the afternoon. The night before the Horde marched south, her father had called her to his war tent. "Valecrath stays," Grashmer said. She'd understood immediately. The southern campaign was into territory no amount of Orcish intelligence had fully mapped. The Horde's most experienced trackers couldn't read the terrain. There were rumors of new weapons the southern human city-states had acquired, weapons designed specifically to defeat Orcish war doctrine. Grashmer had decided, with the calculating coldness that made him the warlord he was, that a human medic in a purely Orcish formation heading into human-controlled territory was a liability the Horde couldn't afford. Too many ways it could go wrong. Too many ways a human face in the ranks could be used against them. "He will stay and manage the fortress medical stores," her father said. "He will be here when we return." "He won't agree to that," Jarine said. "He already has." Grashmer's eyes were steady. "I spoke with him this morning, he understood." She'd found Marcus in the medical stores, cataloging supplies with the focused quiet she'd come to know as his form of distress. He didn't catalog supplies unless something was bothering him. She stood in the doorway. He kept writing. "You agreed," she said. "Your father framed it as a request," he said, still writing. "I didn't want to be rude to your father. You've argued with my father 9 times in the past year. I pick my battles." He set the ledger down, turned to look at her. The lamplight caught the silver in his hair, the particular lines around his eyes that she'd memorized the way you memorize something you know you'll need to reconstruct later from memory. "He's right, you know. My face in that formation is a risk, not to me, to your people." "I know he's right," she said. "I'm still angry about it." He almost smiled. "That's fair." She crossed the room and he put his hands on either side of her face, the way he always did when he wanted her to look at him directly, and she looked because she always did, and he said, "I'll be here. I'll count the days." "I'll be back before the winter rains," she told him. He nodded. He'd pressed his forehead to hers, and she'd felt the warmth of it, and then the drums had started, and she'd walked away without looking back because she'd known that if she looked back she would lose something she couldn't afford to lose before a campaign. That had been 8 months ago. She'd lost the campaign in 6. Not the war, not entirely, but the campaign, which was nearly the same thing. The southern city-states had not had merely new weapons. They'd had a new alliance, a consolidation of 4 rival territories that no Orcish intelligence had anticipated because it was, by any historical measure, a political impossibility. Those 4 territories had been at each other's throats for 3 generations. They should have been incapable of cooperation. Apparently, no one had told them that. The Horde had not been destroyed. Grashmer was too good for that. But the campaign had broken on the fortified plains outside a city called Ardenmere, broken against infantry lines that held when they shouldn't have held, against aerial assets the Horde had no answer for, against a kind of grinding, methodical, unglamorous defensive warfare that didn't have the shape of an orcish battle at all, and was therefore hard to read and counter in time. The Horde had retreated. The warlord had retreated. And retreat for the Horde meant disbanding, splitting into clans, dispersing along old migration routes, vanishing into the territories where human armies couldn't follow without losing their supply lines. Grashmer had been wounded in the retreat, not fatally. He was, as he had always been, too stubborn to die conveniently. But a crossbow bolt had caught him in the left shoulder at a bad angle, and the wound had festered during the retreat, and by the time they reached the northern crossing he was feverish and diminished and barely recognizable as the warlord who had marched south 8 months prior. He'd sent riders ahead. The riders arrived at the fortress 12 days before the Horde did. Jarine had read the dispatch in the small stone room she used for correspondence, in the gray light of an early morning. She'd read it twice. She'd set it on the table and looked at the north-facing window for a long time. The dispatch said the campaign was over. It said the Horde was dispersing. It said her father needed the fortress medical stores and her father's best healer. And there, 3 lines from the end, a single sentence that she'd read and reread until the words stopped being words. Veilcrath was not at the forward position when the retreat was called. His status is unknown. She didn't make a sound. She folded the dispatch carefully, placed it back in its case, and went to Marcus's room. His room was unchanged. That was the thing that stopped her in the doorway. His room was exactly as he'd left it 8 months ago. His field tools laid out on the table with the precision that was pure Marcus Vale, his spare coat on the hook by the door, 3 books stacked on the bedside table with a dried grass blade marking a page in the middle one, which meant he'd been in the middle of it when the drums called her away. She'd never seen his room from the outside. She'd always arrived and been inside it. Standing in the doorway, it looked like a room holding its breath. She picked up the middle book, found the page, read 1 line of it, and the night showed him everything he'd left undone. She put it back exactly as she'd found it. She sat at the edge of the bed, and she waited. Not for a message exactly, not for news. She understood what unknown status meant. She'd read enough military dispatches to know it was the softest possible way to say what it meant. But she also knew Marcus Vale. She knew the way he navigated bad situations with a calm that bordered on supernatural, the way he thought sideways around problems when direct approaches failed, the way he'd once kept a badly wounded Orcish captain alive for 6 days on improvised materials in a cave during a blizzard simply because he'd decided the captain wasn't done yet. If anyone could survive a battlefield retreat through hostile territory with no support, it was the bone mender who does not run. She decided, sitting there in his room, that she would wait. That was 2 years ago. The Horde dispersed. Grashmer recovered slowly, grudgingly, complaining about every day of bed rest in a way that suggested he found inactivity a deeper wound than the bolt had been. The fortress was maintained on skeleton staff, the remaining warriors reassigned or dismissed to their clans. The supply lines that had fed 10,000 warriors were redirected, retrenched, reduced to what a fortress of 40 needed. The war drums went silent. Jarine did not leave. People assumed she was maintaining the fortress for her father. It was a reasonable assumption. It was partly true. But the other part, the part she didn't discuss, was the room with 3 books and a dried grass blade, the coat on the hook, the tools laid out on the table. She kept those things untouched. She did not think of it as grief. She thought of it as precision. If he came back, he would need those things where they were. She was precise about it. In the first year, she'd sent 3 riders north, south, and east, asking after him through the networks of traders and mercenaries and traveling healers who moved through the territories. 1 returned with nothing. 1 returned with a rumor, a human medic, silver-haired, seen in a human city to the southeast, working a free clinic in the lower quarters. She'd sent another rider to that city immediately. That rider returned 3 weeks later with the news that the free clinic existed, and the healer who'd run it had moved on 3 months prior. Nobody knew where. She'd noted it in the dispatch ledger and kept waiting. In the second year, the rumors thinned. The territories settled into a kind of exhausted quiet after the collapse of the Southern campaign, a peace born not of resolution, but of mutual depletion. Human city-states consolidated their gains and stopped advancing. Orcish clans dug in and stopped attacking. The war that had defined 20 years gradually became the war that used to be happening, and then simply the war, spoken of in past tense. In the second year, Jarine began to understand what waiting at a certain pitch and sustained duration did to a person. It didn't break her. She wasn't built for breaking, but it clarified things. It burned away the parts of her that had been assumptions and left only what she actually knew. She'd known in the abstract that she loved him. The waiting made that concrete, specific, detailed in ways she hadn't had words for while he was present. She knew exactly the weight of his voice in a low conversation. She knew the way he went still before he disagreed with something, that one-beat pause. She knew the particular quality of his attention when he was genuinely curious versus when he was merely being polite, and how rarely those two things were the same. She knew these things the way you know a language you learned in childhood, not by reciting rules but by feeling instantly when something is wrong. She wrote nothing of this down, she sat with it. On a morning in the second year's late autumn, a woman arrived at the fortress gate. She was human, which meant she'd already navigated the outer sentinels with some difficulty. She was perhaps 50, with close-cropped gray hair and a healer's satchel on her shoulder, and the look of someone who'd been walking for more than one day. The gate guard brought her to Jarine's receiving room, and she stood there in road dust and looked at Jarine with the directness that Jarine had come to associate specifically with human medics. Something about the profession stripped the social performance out of them. "You're the warlord's daughter," the woman said. "Jarine." "Yes. I worked with Marcus Vale." She set the satchel on the floor. "My name is Physician Sira Dalmuth. I was the field surgeon attached to the 4th Southern Alliance Force during the Ardenmere campaign. I was on the battlefield when the retreat was called." Everything in Jarine went very quiet. "Sit down," she said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of that. Sira Dalmuth sat. She looked at the Orc princess, at the amber eyes, the iron rings still on the battle hands, the perfect stillness, and she said, "He's alive. I need you to understand that first before I tell you the rest." The breath Jarine released was not a sob. It was more structural than that, something in her architecture redistributing, bearing a weight differently. She said, "Tell me." The story Sira Dalmuth told took an hour. Jarine didn't interrupt once. The short version. In the chaos of the Ardenmere retreat, Marcus Vale had been cut off from the Horde formation when the Southern Alliance forces pressed a flanking charge into the rear lines. He'd gone down in the confusion, not to a wound, but to a simple fall in broken ground, and by the time he'd recovered his bearings, the Horde had passed him, and the Alliance lines were between him and them. Rather than attempt to cross through active combat, he'd done what any experienced field medic would do in a situation where one option meant certain death, and the other meant surviving long enough to find a better option. He'd stayed low, moved slow, and waited. He'd been found by Alliance medics. Here was where the story became complicated. The Alliance medics had recognized him, not personally, but by description. Valecrath, the bone mender who does not run, was not unknown to the Southern human forces. He treated their wounded as well as Orcish wounded on 3 occasions when the battlefield created spaces of temporary ceasefire. You cannot work a medical tent in active warfare for 7 years without both sides knowing your face. The Alliance medics had brought him to their field hospital, treated a laceration on his leg, and then turned him over to Alliance intelligence. Alliance intelligence had held him for 8 months. Not as a prisoner, Sira said, not officially, as a resource. He knew things about Horde medical protocols, supply routes, unit structures. They wanted that information. Did he give it? Sierra looked at her steadily. What do you think? Jarine said nothing. They kept him in comfortable circumstances, Sierra continued. Not a cell, a guarded house in Ardenmere. They gave him access to medical texts, which was probably a mistake on their part because he spent 12 months updating his methodology and became considerably better at his job. They tried persuasion, then offers of compensation, then what I understand were fairly substantial threats. He remained polite throughout. He asked, consistently and without variation, to be released. They declined consistently and without variation. How did you find me? He told me to. Sierra reached into the satchel and produced a folded paper. He knew I was traveling through the northern territories. He asked me to find the warlord's daughter and tell her what I've told you, and to give her this. Jarine took the paper. It was folded 3 times, sealed with a smear of candle wax. Her name on the outside, in his handwriting, precise, slightly left-leaning, the letters of someone who'd learned to write under field conditions where you needed to get it done correctly the first time. She opened it. She read it. She read it a second time. She folded it carefully and put it in the inner pocket of her coat, close to her chest. Where is he now? She asked. Still in Ardenmere, the same house. They haven't moved him. Sierra studied her. I should tell you the Alliance garrison there is substantial. 400 soldiers, fortified position, and Ardenmere itself is. I know what Ardenmere is, Jarine said. I was at the battle. A silence settled between them. I told him I'd find you, Sierra said quietly. I didn't tell him what you'd do with the information. No, Jarine agreed. He wouldn't have asked you to promise that. He wouldn't want to put that weight on you. He said, Sierra paused. He said, tell her I'm counting the days. Jarine stood up. She spent 3 days in preparation, not from uncertainty, but from respect for the problem. Her father was recovering but not yet mobile. She did not tell him what she intended. She told him she was riding south to scout the territory, which was true in the sense that all her plans were true in their individual components, even when the assembled whole was something her father would have strong opinions about. She gathered 7 warriors, all of whom had served the full 7 years with Marcus Vale, and understood what he was, and what it meant that he was somewhere he shouldn't be. She gathered medical supplies because she intended to bring a medic home, and it seemed appropriate to have supplies ready for him. She gathered 3 changes of clothes, maps, and 40 days of road provisions. She studied the maps. Ardenmere was a 3-week ride south. It was heavily fortified, yes. Alliance garrison of 400, yes. But the city was also a functioning city. It had markets, traders, the ordinary traffic of commerce and population that kept cities alive in peacetime. A Horde fortress was a war installation. A city in peacetime was something you could move through, if you were careful, if you were patient, if you looked like someone with legitimate purpose and didn't carry your weapons where they showed. She left before dawn on the 4th day. The road south was strange after years inside stone walls, not unpleasant strange. The land had changed in 2 years of peace, in the way that land does when armies stop passing over it. Things grew back. Roads softened. The pitted ruts left by supply wagons filled with new soil. She rode through village markets and border crossings where the guards were bored rather than alert, through the small, ordinary texture of territories that had stopped expecting attack. She watched the human communities they passed through with the careful attention she gave everything, noting how people moved differently in peacetime, slower, more dispersed, less aware of exit routes and defensible positions. On the 15th day, they crossed into what had been Alliance territory, and she left the other 6 warriors at a roadside way station with instructions and a timeline, and enough coin to stay comfortable and inconspicuous, and continued south with only her own face and her own wits. She had been born the warlord's daughter. She had been raised in war councils, reading dispatches before she could reliably tie her own bootlaces, listening to strategy discussions that most adult warriors would have found impenetrable. She understood warfare. She also understood, because she was her father's daughter and her father was one of the finest military minds of his generation, that warfare and force were simply two of many tools, and that a competent strategist used the right tool for the problem in front of her. The problem in front of her was not a battle. It was an extraction. Ardenmere was, as she'd known it would be, a city settling into its new post-war identity. She found a room in an inn near the lower market, changed out of her road gear into the rougher dress of a northern trader. There were enough mixed-race traders in the border territories that an orc woman with weathered clothes and a merchant's air attracted notice, but not the kind of notice that meant soldiers. She walked the city for 3 days. She watched the rhythms of the garrison, shift changes, patrol routes, the particular hours when attention was loosest. She found the house. It was in the merchant district, which was either irony or pragmatism on the Alliance's part, surrounded by civilians, well-funded enough to have regular guards at the door, but not so visibly militarized that it would alarm the neighbors. She watched the house for 6 hours. She saw him on the second day, in the small walled garden at the back, visible through a gap in the wall where 2 stones had shifted and never been repaired. He was sitting at a small table with a medical text, reading with the particular focused intensity that meant he was actually reading rather than performing it. And he was thinner than she remembered, and his hair was more silver than it had been, and her hands went very still on the stones of the wall. He looked up for no discernible reason, just lifted his head and looked at the gap in the wall. She was standing in shadow and he shouldn't have been able to see her. He looked for a long moment, then looked back down at his book. Then he looked up again. She moved deliberately into the thin bar of afternoon light that came through the gap. He went completely still. Then, very carefully, very quietly, he set the book face down on the table and put his hands flat on the surface and did not move. The way you don't move when you've seen something you're not certain is real, and you don't want to startle it away. She allowed herself one moment, just one, where she let herself feel the full weight of what 2 years of waiting at a certain pitch felt like when it arrived at the thing it had been pointed toward. Then she put it away, back in the place in her chest where she'd been keeping it, and she thought clearly. She held up 3 fingers. He watched. She pointed south. He nodded slightly. She held up 2 fingers. He nodded again. She pointed at herself, then down. Stay, I'll come back. He kept his hands flat on the table. He nodded once more. She stepped back out of the light. She moved to the southern wall of the garden, away from the guard side door, and began, with methodical patience, to study how it was constructed. The extraction took 2 more days. It was not, ultimately, dramatic. The most important breakthroughs rarely are. It required a distraction at the main gate that one of her 6 warriors produced at the appointed hour, a rope of the specific length she'd calculated, a section of garden wall that turned out to have exactly the structural characteristics she'd anticipated, and the willingness of one Alliance guard to accept a very good bribe from what appeared to be a northern merchant woman who had made some bad decisions and needed her cousin released from what appeared to be a misunderstanding with the civic authorities. The bribe was substantial. She had planned for that. The moment he came over the wall, she had her hand on his arm before he'd finished landing. He caught his balance, looked at her, just looked, for 2 full seconds, the way he'd looked at her through the gap in the wall, and she said quietly, "Can you ride?" "Yes," he said. "Then we go now." They went. The ride north was 12 days of the kind of quiet that 2 people fall into when they have a great deal to say and understand, instinctively, that the road is not the place to say it. He was thinner. His hands were the same. On the 4th night she sat at the fire and he sat beside her, and after a long time he said simply, "Thank you." She looked at the fire. "You said you'd count the days," she said. "I did," he said. I counted 812. She turned to look at him. I lost count once, he admitted. Around month 7, had to estimate back. I think I got it right. She put her hand over his, on the ground between them, and left it there, and neither of them said anything else for a long time. On the 9th day, one of her riders, the one she'd posted a day south as a rear guard, knowing Alliance intelligence might respond quickly once the house was found empty, brought news that a small pursuit force had ridden out of Ardenmere heading north. 20 soldiers. She considered this. 20 soldiers was not nothing. She had 7 warriors and 1 medic who'd spent 2 years not in combat. The pursuit force had horses and Alliance training, and presumably something to prove. She called her group together. The next 2 days were the kind of work she'd been trained for since she could walk, not grand warfare, not the pitched battles of the southern campaigns, but the granular, patient, specific work of moving people through territory that wasn't safe. She knew every ford, every ridgeline, every choke point of the northern border territories better than she knew her own face. She'd studied those maps on paper. She'd ridden those roads on the way south. She'd walked them in memory 1,000 times during 2 years of waiting, running scenarios. She used 3 of those scenarios. The pursuit force found their trail 3 times and lost it 3 times. On the 3rd occasion, the detachment that had been sent on what turned out to be a false lead into a river valley had to make a choice between continuing north into Orcish territory or withdrawing, and they withdrew, because they were 20 soldiers in peaceful times, and the math of crossing that border uninvited was bad math. On the 11th night, she told Marcus what she'd done. He listened. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You planned the false trail before you left." "I planned several contingencies before I left." He was quiet again. She could see him doing the thing he did, running the logistics of it backwards, reconstructing the scope of the planning that had gone into what had looked, at the execution end, like a smooth extraction. "You spent 3 days preparing," he said. 4. "You studied the maps." "I always study the maps." "Jarine." She looked at him. "You could have sent someone else," he said quietly. "You didn't have to come yourself." She had thought about how to answer this during 12 days of riding. She'd thought about it for 2 years before that, in various forms, turning it over in the way you turn over a thing you already know the answer to but want to be precise about. "No," she said, "I couldn't have." He held her gaze for a long time. 812 days, she said, is a long time to know exactly where you would and wouldn't go. In the morning, they crossed the border. She remembered the last time she'd crossed it in the opposite direction, 8 months after he'd agreed to stay, the drums retreating behind her, the deliberate choice not to look back. She crossed it now in the other direction, in the gray light of an autumn morning with frost on the ground cover and the familiar silhouette of the northern ridges rising ahead of her, and she allowed herself, for just a moment, to feel the full weight of what return meant. Grashmer was on his feet by the time they reached the fortress. Not at full strength, he moved carefully, holding one shoulder differently than he used to, but upright in the forecourt, which meant he'd been told they were coming. He looked at Marcus Vale for a long time. "Valecrath," he said finally. "You look terrible." "Thank you, Warlord," Marcus said. "You look like you took a crossbow bolt to the shoulder." Grashmer looked at his daughter. Everything went as planned. "Near enough," she said. "Near enough is what plans become," her father said, and turned and walked back inside, which was the closest Grashmer had ever come to expressing satisfaction. They gave Marcus his room back. He stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at the table, tools laid out exactly as he'd left them, coat on the hook, 3 books with the dried grass blade still holding his page. He was very still. "I counted the days," she said from behind him. He turned to look at her. His face in the lamplight was the face she'd memorized, lines around the eyes, the jaw that had decided not to care about being hit. and she'd known it would be there, had told herself she knew, but knowing and seeing were not the same thing, and she felt the difference in her chest like a door opening. "You didn't move anything," he said. "Precision," she said. He picked up the middle book, found his page. She watched him read one line, watched the small shift in his expression. He put the book back. He looked at her. "I have catching up to do," he said. 812 days, she agreed. He almost smiled. "I'll need a running start." She said, "You have always known how to find me." "You move like you're looking for a problem to solve," he said. "I've learned your pace." There, in the doorway of a room that had held its breath for 2 years and was now breathing again, with the fortress walls around them and the northern winter beginning to settle over the ridges outside, and her father recovered enough to be insufferable about it in the way that only Grashmer could be, and 812 days accumulated and paid in full between them. There, Jarine laughed again. Really laughed, the kind that surprised you. And Marcus Vale looked exactly as pleased with himself as she'd been counting on. Some things, it turned out, were precise enough to survive any distance.